I am Daniel Likis, and welcome to Book 101 Review. And in celebration of Poetry Month, this coming April, we make Sapha Sunday a Poetry Day.
Hello, everybody. So excited about poetry.
Yes, last week we indulged with poetry of Miss Sapha Burnell. Please do listen to our the first book of Miss Burnell. It's been 10 years, right?
It's been 10 years. This is the 10th anniversary edition that I have in my hand. It's incredible to me that it's lasted 10 years, and every year it still continues to go out there and be read by more people. And I love that. You know, poetry is just such a special part of life. And today we're going to be able to dive into why. So,
Why?
why? Why is poetry special? Okay, well,
Why, Miss Burnell?
I think poetry releases us in a way more than any other written form or lyrical form. So, whether it's oral, you know, even things like spoken word, all the way down to the things that are on the page. One, it's one of the earliest forms of literature we have. You know, if we go back to something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, that is poetic. It is a work of poetry, of epic poetry. We think of, you know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, you know, all of these works of sort of kind of Hellene and Western foundational literature is poetry. We also get incredible amounts of poetry from Japan, you know, and by the time we get into the Heian the Heian era, we have some amazing poetry. You know, you just think of all of these different sets of poems that people were writing back and forth. Incredibly beautiful with a lot of austere words, if I may say, you know, forms which limit the amount of words per line, and things that we get in Japanese, which is just so gorgeously beautiful and so evocative with so little. You know, it really is one of the oldest forms of art that we have and that we can study. And I think for me, poetry is a way of sharing emotion and sharing presence and mindset that really makes a lot of people feel something. You know, and no, not everybody's going to feel something when they read, you know, Robert Frost talking about a path less taken. A lot of people are probably going to roll their eyes because it's just become a meme at this point. But there's going to be poetry that evokes something to them in a very sort of releasing way. You know, when you're reading poetry, you're in this almost experimental space. You're in this space to really just kind of dive in, read something over and over again in a fairly, depending on the poem, short amount of time. And I love that. I love being able to dive into something that is so condensed and so dense with meaning. You know, it's just makes me
Something
feel
else.
something.
Something within your soul. So, Miss
Yeah.
Burnell, how did you balance clarity and ambiguity in your poetry?
Well, the first thing I did was have other people in my life read it. You know, quite a few of the poems that ended up in Usurper Kings were poems that were written while I had access to an incredible professor at my university who would jolly well tell you, thank you very much, if you need to go back and do this again, because this is shite. And, you know, she's this very prim older woman, always had perfect red lipstick, a perfect scarf around her neck, you know, and she would just sit there very beautifully and then tear you down. And that worked for me. You know, that worked for me at the time. She would just flat out say, you are being, you know, creatively ambiguous. Try again. You know, and I was like, okay, back to the drawing board. And then it was her voice in my head, even years later when I was writing the other poems that went into Usurper Kings. I was like, oh yeah, I'm being creatively ambiguous. And I think the part of it too is with poetry, we have to understand how much of this poem is being presented with a very significant meaning to the poet, and how much is being presented as a way to allow the reader to respond how they see fit. There's a couple different ways of looking at it from literary theory perspective. There is, the poet deems meaning. The poet is attempting to be very evocative and very personal and very precise with the amount of meaning that they give. But then there's also a way of framing the reading of literature where, by the time that poem has been created, by the time it's bound in the book, it no longer belongs to the poet in a way. It belongs to the person reading it and what they get out of it and how it connects to something similar in their lives. And so there's a couple ways of looking at it. I think for me, if there's something that I want somebody to desperately kind of cling to, and it's important enough for me to really kind of bring that home, then yes, I'm going to be fairly explicit in what that thing is. But if this is meant to create a sense of mood, a sense of emotion, a sense of exploration in the reader, then I might allow a certain amount of ambiguity in that poem, in those images, very beautiful images, but images that allow the person to go, oh, that made me think of this, which made me think of that. And now they're sitting there reminiscing about, their sainted great aunt who was amazing and, who homesteaded in the middle of a wilderness in the United States and, without no man, I had that happen too, just recently with a friend of mine. We were talking about poetry and it brought up, this and then she started, oh, I have this picture of my great aunt and here she was and she was amazing. And that really made me think of this. And, you write about this when you write about Hera and I could just see her. And that was the point of that, getting people to release their skepticism of both themselves and the environment they're in and find something closer to the real, to the idealist kind of real inside them, closer to that sense of joined humanity so we can all get out of this alive.
Yes, idealism,
Mhm.
people. So, what challenges have you faced in seeking publication or sharing your poetry with others?
Well, Usurper Kings was my first book. So I was working on novels in the background. I was working on some pieces of short fiction, and I had just come from being more closely aligned to the film industry, trying to break into that market when I realized I would have more kind of creative control over my screenplays if I wrote novels first. And so I had just recently kind of switched my mind, even though I had written poetry for a long time, just getting people to trust somebody that at the time did not have a lot of credits behind my name when it came to literature. It really is true that for a lot of poets, getting your poems into literary journals, it's such an important thing because that shows that one, your poem is put together enough that people outside of yourself and your friend group want to read it. Two, it means that you've worked with an editor. You've seen a contract before. You understand some of the process of how printing a magazine or getting a work out there works. So you're not naive to certain things in the publishing industry. You've had a time or two, a time or three, a time or four to really kind of dive in and learn about this and see whether or not it's the kind of process that you want to do, because there's a gigantic difference between being somebody who is creatively inclined and putting poems out, say, on a website or to their friends and things like that, and working through the business of publishing and the business of being an author. So getting that series of journal credits, that series of magazine credits with poetry, it takes a while. It not only takes a while, it's an incredibly nerve-wracking kind of thing because you're tossing out these poems and you're trying to get some traction on them, and the odds are you're going to be rejected far more times than you are going to be accepted. And that not only takes time, but it also takes pluck. And it takes the ability to kind of shake off rejection. And so that is definitely both, I would call it a proving ground. I'm not going to use massively positive or massively negative kind of thoughts with that. It's a proving ground. And it really kind of shakes loose, I think, that potential of whether you want to be a publishing poet or whether you want to be a poet who keeps their beautiful manuscript in a drawer and brings it out when they want to and puts it online, puts it on a website, or just shares it with the people that they love. And there's no right or wrong there. It's not like one is better than the other. It's just the difference of choice. And that's what I had to shake down too, whether or not my poetry was going to make me a poet, or whether my poetry was going to be a wonderful creative outlet that's like, oh, aren't I so glad that I can do that? And then I would move on with something else in my life. And I got the opportunity to work with some people who had just started a small press. And so they were looking for another book to put out. And they were a small press that was so small, it was like 2 people. And they were basically throwing spaghetti at the wall. And I'm like, well, let's try short story collection. Let's try poetry. Let's try, and they had released a memoir that sold hundreds of thousands of copies in its first couple of years. A memoir about a prominent West African dignitary and educator and pastor. And so they had done that, and they're like, okay, well, we know how this works. Let's try something else. And I had been helpful when it came to the memoir because it was about a distant family member. And they were like, oh, well, you have manuscripts. We know you do. And I was like, I'm still working on some things. I don't think I'm quite ready yet. And they're like, well, what about your poetry? How is it? And it sort of fell in my lap in a way. And so it was a very rare occurrence, kind of being quote unquote scouted by a tiny, tiny small press. But it also was a very big risk to not go forward with trying to find other presses to put this in, but to trust a tiny little team which had zero experience with poetry and were still kind of learning how to get their feet wet. But it was a beautiful chance to take, and I'm glad I took it. So.
Yes, and congratulations for that. So, Ms. Burnell, why it takes so long? There is a follow-up for this poetry book, Usurper Kings.
Oh, I think that would be why.
Why?
That would be this one,
Oh,
Common Monstrous.
yes.
That would also it's Neon Lieben. I took a break from poetry in order to work on my cyberpunk series, which the first novel, Neon Lieben, came out in 2021. I also published Son of Abel, the very first edition of Son of Abel, in that time as well. And that started my cyberpunk world. My mythpunk world. I have not had coffee yet. Can you notice, everybody?
Yeah.
So I went to writing novels, I really did. And with Neon Lieben, there were several years there where I was cranking out manuscripts, doing a lot of scientific studying so that I could make the science that I put in as plausible as I could. There was a lot of research and things that went into that time. And I had actually written 2 other novels in the series first. And my editor was like, these are great. We love these. They're not number 1. These are like novels 3 and 4, maybe 4 and 5 down the list. And I'm like, oh, no, I want to start here. I want to start with this character. They're like, do you though? And I was like, no, you need to start here. They're like, no, I want to get to know Anakin when he's a kid first.
Yes.
Before I see him as Darth Vader. And, obviously a reference to Star Wars. But, and so that novel, which is called Hedonism Wholesale Inc. and will be coming out in a little bit, that took a lot of time to produce because it was very intense, hard science fiction cyberpunk. And I was talking to geneticists, I was talking to, cyber robotics experts, I was talking to tons of different people just to try and, get a handle on the science and the physics of travel in the solar system and all these kinds of things. And my editor was like, yeah, but who's Lieben? Yeah, but who's Adarastos? Well, we'll find out about them later in a prequel. And they're like, no. No. And so I had to go back and change my approach and work on Neon Lieben instead in a furious attempt to get the first book out. So really, my poetry kind of took second fiddle to writing the Mythpunk series and writing the Cyberpunk series, but I've been chipping away on the side with a few more poems here and there. So we're almost to the point of another poetry collection. Still don't have a title yet, and we'll see. We're cheekily going through on the sidelines trying to
Yes.
figure it out.
In celebration of poetry, it is coming month. People, Miss Sapha Burnell will produce another kind of books that make you soul, let's say, melt. Your soul will melt because of the poetry of Miss Burnell. So, how do you handle criticism of feedback on your poetry works?
The first thing I do is look at the person who's saying it. Before I feel offended. And I mean, okay, criticism is hard to take. Especially with poetry, it's such a personal thing. We are putting our hearts on our sleeves. We're putting out oftentimes somewhat uncomfortable things about ourselves into poetry and hoping that people love it or feel something about it, or we can share some form of emotion or experience. And so that's intrinsically difficult, to handle when somebody goes, early on with Usurper Kings, there's quite a few poems in the collection where my loved ones, my friends and my family were like, oh, no, it was very good. We really liked it. I had to look up several words. Did you know I didn't even know what this word meant? I was like, oh, shoot. Because I kind of went, all right, roll up the sleeves, like, let's go. And I did so much research in university with the backgrounds of English literature and ancient literature that I was using words that, have not been used in conversation in a good, 400 years. So there's a certain level of pretension with that. And there's a certain level of, yeah, you know what? A lot of people are not going to know what that means. And so the first thing you have to kind of do is go, is this my target market? I say this quite a bit on my streams. I do editing and live beta read streams on Twitch every week. And, I do an education session every month for just free for people who are interested in the written word. And I say this a lot. If you are writing a work of, say, against cyberpunk, hard sci-fi, going into cyberpunk, and you have somebody rip it apart, first take a look and, oh, wait, that person only reads historical romance novels. Well, if they only read historical romance novels, then there's nothing in something like Neon Leavin which is going to fetch their eye. Of course they're going to be critical of it because it's not their thing. So I look to see who it is that's talking about it first and see, like, okay, are they that sort of target market? Is there a way to bridge the gap? Is there a way to kind of modify myself and my poetry to be more reflective for more people? That's a total fair statement too. Sometimes the people who criticize you are right, and you just need to be told in a different way. And sometimes, the friends, the family, the editors going, yeah, but do you want to put that in there like that? Don't you want to try and look for a couple other words, or don't you want to do something else? Maybe, they've been trying to tell you something for months and you haven't been listening until finally someone goes, no, that poem's terrible. It's like, oh, excuse me while I get my feelings hurt. No, but you have to separate your feelings when you get criticism and look first to see if there's any validity to it. Because if there is validity to it, it's not necessarily the kindest world out there when it comes to literary review. There are a lot of books. There are more books out there than people will ever read. And so whether or not your stuff is approachable or accessible to the people that you are hoping will read it, that does require editing. That's not going to be perfect the right way. And I would much rather hear it from an editor or a beta reader than a critic. So I kind of suck it up. I pour myself a lovely cup of coffee and I look through the critiques, and then I decipher whether or not I'm going to accept this critique as in, oh, wow, they have a point. Whether I'm going to look at it and be like, okay, they have a point, but this is specifically a different kind of work, so I can set that point aside, which I've had to do a few times when I had some beta readers who were really interested in one book. They tried reading the other series, and they tried to basically put the same mind frame that they had for the cyberpunk world into the mythpunk world, and they're completely different genres, and the expectations are very different. So you have to kind of, measure how much of this critique are you going to take to heart, and then you just need to knuckle down and get your work done.
Yes.
Set your ego out the door
Leave
and make
behind.
something better.
Yes.
Like,
Leave behind because sometimes critics make you perfect. In what way? To make your product
mhm.
more excellent in the other people. But before we go on, Miss Burnell, I want to shout out to the people listening according to my ranking tops in the last 30 days because in Bolivia got number 2 on the Apple chart, Pakistan at number 8, Nigeria at number 12, United Arab Emirates at 16, Bhutan at 18, Jamaica 61, Cameroon at 78, Thailand, Cambodia, Zambia, Vietnam, and a lot more. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast because this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world. And of course, poetry people. This podcast is empowering poetry people. And this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world, like Miss Sapha Burnell. So, Miss Burnell, let's go to reading a poem. One of your favorite poem.
One of my favorite poems. Ooh, okay. Let's see here. Let's find it. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I am looking in my own poetry collection. There's one poem that actually needs to be performed with two people,
Okay.
usually a male and a female voice. It's called Adam Eve, and you can read them as two separate poems because the Adam section is on one side of the page, Eve is on the other, and so you can read like Adam's section as his own, Eve's section as her own, but you can also perform them together. That one's really fun, but it requires a little bit more. All right, performance.
So next week, let's do that. I will be the Adam and you'll be the Eve.
That sounds great. Here
That's
we go.
interesting.
Where did it go? All right. Neon Lights. This is from the Helen of Troy cycle that I have in my poetry collection. This is poem number 2, and these sets of poems in the Helen of Troy cycle were things that I wrote while on set. Producing a little independent TV pilot. So, experiencing desire, lust, terror for the masses, and despite them, masses, dipping into madness, villainy, love, as he survives, amnesty, a picture with a famous man, hate. Can we get another? It didn't flash. Privacy. Oh, this one's for my daughter. She's a big fan. Identity. Can you sign my vest, chest, family crest? The rest dies. As he lives harder, shorter, condensing years, dulce de leche out of condensed milk, boiled in saucepans on rickety camp stoves. Tragedy, liberty, contracts, managers, agents, fans, directors, deals and scripts, treatments and camera lenses. The show, you know. Take a breath. Silence on set. Must go on. Instant zen with 40 watching eyes. Act between heartbeats, a sniper stealing the show. Terror, horror, happiness, joy, love, heartbreak, take after take after take after break. Break. Gotta break. 5 for makeup, 2 for hair, 1 for water. Drink your zen, peppermint cocoa. Begin again. He gives you a reason for abundance, stamina, refreshing emotion many imitate. Wash out. You are not one, blessing infinite and bold, as cold and old as the cosmos holds on mercy after mercy after mercy, take after take after take. Life canters on inside our time continuum, wastes and edges us, lifetimes after lifetimes after lifetimes in weeks, months, years, reincarnation and immortality on celluloid, the fate of talent. It makes us old souls, gives us the time to be excellent, outstanding, unsettling. Until the job is done, oh, you're the best, mighty and resolute. Give it to me again. Quiet on set. Rolling. Action.
Let's give a big hand to Miss Sapha Burnell. Good job, Miss Burnell. So can you explain to us about that poem?
So this poem, Neon Lights, was me while I was producing and watching one of the actors, do multiple takes of a couple of scenes. And this is something to me too, as somebody who was trotting the boards in theater. I did act for many years. My teachers at school would say I acted up, but I was also doing it on stage sometimes. So that experience of having to do things over and over and over again and still somehow find the same energy that you had, and you get these kinds of questions and quandaries on film sets, people more like Clint Eastwood who are like, I will give you one really good take. Don't waste it. And it's like, get as many cameras as you can on that person because he's not doing that again. You can have that kind of thing. Or like Werner Herzog was famous for saying that and getting very little coverage when he was filming Nicolas Cage. And the people on set were like, oh, but coverage, what about coverage? Like, we're finished already today, the scene. Like, we need more coverage. And finally, the anecdote being Nicolas Cage grabbed an apple box, stood on top of it and went, hey, everybody come around, come on, crew, come around. I am finally working with a director who knows what he wants. Back off. Anecdotally, this is something that was explained in Werner Herzog's masterclass, so that's where I got that anecdote. But that idea that sometimes when you're filming something, you're doing these scenes, dozens of times in a day. The same words, the same thing over and over. And I was trying to kind of use that repetition as a way to sort of even tire us out. Tire us out for take after take. And then those little bits of mercy in there when people are given breaks. It's a lunch break. It's time, got to check your hair, got to check your makeup. Okay. You're getting feedback, from the director. You're kind of setting things up, watching as the lights get set up maybe a little bit differently, getting prepared for another shot. And just the combination of the hectic nature of filming, but also that zone that you have to find yourself in order to perform, and in order to perform multiple times in the same day, the same session. And so that was part of the psychology of this poem. That was definitely part of the experience I was wanting to talk about, as well as just, you get working with actors who are recognized on the street. And okay, let's just grab a picture. And of course, this one I said, can we get another? It didn't flash. Well, that's clearly a sign of pre-smartphone times. Because using an actual camera, all this kinds of thing, and that lack of privacy that, kind of you become an entity for a while, for a certain amount of time in certain situations where you belong to the world instead of belonging to yourself. And so that's where that one came from.
Yes, and congratulations for when you're reading your poem. It melts my soul.
Phew. All those acting lessons.
Yeah, that's awesome. In what ways do you experiment the language and form in your poetry?
I do a lot of work with older forms as well. This is free verse in here. So I was definitely using, repetition. I was using certain kinds of internal rhyme and different things like that in there. I love experimenting with skaldic poetry and the skaldic forms of poetry where you have different internal rhymes. You're using a lot of alliteration. You're using things called kennings, which are kind of phrases for different things, like the Black Raven's Road being the sea, or the bone cage being the body, things like that. They're kind of beat your shield. I love going back to those ancient forms and seeing what I can do with them. And that's really what I've been doing with the poetry I've been writing recently, is kind of going back and trying to revive this sense of system and form in poetry, because I do love free verse. I love it. As you can see, that poem was free verse. But I do find that there is a certain amount of creativity that gets released when you're constrained. It might sound funny, but what's one of the hardest things to do when you're creating something? To be told, oh, just write something. Well, we'll write what? Well, I don't know, whatever.
Yes.
Whatever?
Whatever.
Just anything. So if I wrote 5 words on a napkin and handed it to you, you'd be fine? Oh, no, just write a story. Okay, so there is more to this. You do want an actual thing. Oh, yeah, let's just write a poem about something. Okay, a poem about what? Do you want me to get explicit? Do you want me to, what do you want? Oh, no, just write a poem. I wander lonely as a cloud. La, 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 la. You just kind of, but all of a sudden get told, okay, use the following 7 conditions, if you're doing something a little bit more Renaissance, iambic pentameter, make sure that the end rhymes are present, we want you to use quite a bit of anaphora in this poetry. Oh, okay. And make sure at least 2 couplets have alliteration in them. Great. Okay, here we go. And, do you have any, themes that you want to go to? Okay, we're doing the themes of resurgence of beauty. Okay, great. Oftentimes when you give people a framework in which to work, they can actually do so a lot easier than if you tell them, oh, just go nuts. Just.
Just staring at.
It's like, if you tell someone to just write a story, it's like, okay. Well, I'll write a story about a dog meeting a squirrel. Is that the kind of story you want? Oh no, I was expecting some form of epic adventure with, some form of halfling and elves. And okay, so then why didn't you tell me that's what you wanted? So I find that getting into older styles of poetry, looking at some of the different poetic styles coming from Japan, looking at different poetic styles from skaldic literature and from the Renaissance, it gives enough of a framework that I can work in that it's exciting for me. It's almost like, you have to kind of puzzle through it, but I need this kind of word. So I really like this theme and this image, but I have to change the wording in order to fit with this system. And, you're doing all of these kinds of things, and it releases your creativity in a way that the actual essence of the poem almost becomes subconscious, which is fantastic because your ego can't get in the way. And you can just put it forward in this beautiful way. And I love it. So that's, I love working with older forms. I love kind of incorporating them into my free verse and seeing what comes out.
Yes, come out beautifully. So, how do you think digital platforms have changed the landscape of poetry, writing, and sharing?
Well, for one thing, it makes laying out a poetry collection a little bit more difficult than laying out a prose book. So we were doing this with several poetry collections within the small press that I'm part of, and things like that. And whenever you have poems where you have specific words in specific places on the page, it actually becomes quite difficult to do that in an ebook, in an EPUB. As a PDF, it's totally easy. You just make it however you want it. But if you're doing it as an ebook so that people can, have it on their Kindle and they can change the font size and do all that, it all of a sudden gets really tricky. So there's a little bit of mental gymnastics that you kind of have to go through, depending on whether or not you're going to publish this as an EPUB or whether you're going to just stick with PDF. And a lot of the times too, that's meant that when I've been editing poetry and going, okay, where do you want this to be? And they're like, oh, well, we want to put this, in a digital book. And things like, okay, so you do realize that all of this stuff where you have like 3 words over here and 4 words over there, and that is going to be incredibly difficult to make happen. Oh, really? Yeah. Oh, I had no idea. Are you sure you want it? If you want it, we'll do it. Like totally, do it if you want it, but know that this is going to be a lot more trouble. Oh, no. And oftentimes what I find is, although we have access to a lot of amazing things now, we can add, sound in an electronic copy. You can add motion. You can add all of these wonderful things that make the sort of multidisciplinary and multimedia form of poetry so wonderful. And I'm so glad to see a lot of people experimenting with that. It's fantastic. Ultimately, most poetry, now I'm not saying all poetry, but most poetry is words on a page. It's static. It sits there. It doesn't move around and wobble about, and it's just present. And so it's interesting to see what can be done. And the thing that I love is, something that I've done myself. I started making short films about my poems and putting them, on places like YouTube. And it's a lot of fun to take something like, The Cuckoo and turn it into a little short film. That's a lot of fun. At the same time, I recognize that it's also static words on a page. And so it almost is as if, you have the poetry is words on a page. It is the static organism that just lives, black strokes on white. It lives there like that. But then you can further take that and reinterpret it in, film, in music. You can reinterpret it with sound. You can reinterpret it in so many different ways, which is exciting to see. But for me, those are interpretations of the strokes on a page. And so I definitely do see them as slightly separate mediums. They are still part of poetry, and they are still beautiful parts of poetry. But, thinking of Marshall McLuhan and the medium is the message, the second that it no longer is specifically just words on a page, you're creating a new organism. You're creating a further evolution of the form, which I think is beautiful. But we want to make sure we have both.
Yes, perfectly said, Miss Burnell. But before we go, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, people, on our fourth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of the five-star restaurant in downtown Toronto. So please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about one of the Italian cuisine, one of the trademark of Italian cuisine, Parmigiana, people, Parmigiana. Plus, our books are out, not only one but 13 volumes, people. Food 101, Volume 1 Basics until 13 is only the books that you need. How to create a delicious food. And thank you, Canada, for being number 10 on the Apple chart. Thank you for supporting Food 101. I hope you're going to support Book 101 review at number 1 on the Apple chart. With Miss Sapha Burnell. Do you know Miss Sapha Burnell? Our short videos on YouTube, it garnered 500 views already. Oh, thank you.
Yay!
Yay. We're
Thank
talking
you,
about
everybody. Thank
that's
you.
our first video, short videos that I publish on YouTube. And thank you so much for watching it. And I hope you will continue watching Book 101 review and number 1 on the Apple chart in Canada.
Let's go.
Yes. So, Miss Burnell, let's let's read one more of your famous poetry or poem.
Ooh, let's see here. I promise I won't pick one of the ones that's like 20 pages long. Let's do this. I got asked out in a cafe. Working on art for the mass of one lone fan, he sat and drank his cup of joe across the communal table. Critical mass of conversations, decades of probing condensed into fragments, seconds, flickered glances, until we part. And then there's a second poem to that, Spinning Needle. Slow, methodical spin, yarning the world by inches, microns, Higgs bosons, and high-low quarks. Coffee stagnates to a milky hue, conversation convecting the chill liquid. Her finger pricks on his stubble, he slowly turns the wheel. How he thinks, his stance majestic. Excitement and thrill pounds tables behind them. She tries to look, falters, oh, it might be rude. Time became the fabric he spun. She spun, tugging the wheel in a throaty attempt to salvage her feminine dignity and give no quarter to the preconceived man, the settler who spins. So that was a two-part, based quite literally on meeting somebody at a coffee shop and being asked out, and then having the date and being like, okay, this is okay, this is done. Yeah, okay, no, thank you. You're wonderful. Yeah, no, we are looking for very different things in life, and that's okay. Lovely person. No shade on that person. He was just looking for something very different. But it was just that idea of time being the fabric in which he spun. Because I just remember being in this situation, being like, how do I get out of this? How do I, politely, nicely just be like, you know what, it is fantastic that you want 6 children and to have that kind of home life. I don't, but you're going to find somebody amazing because you're sweet. And so you're trying to kind of like, oh, how do you get through that? And of course, being me, I had to think of those spins with microns spinning and, the Higgs boson particles. We were just trying to find out the weight of it at the time. And so it was this mysterious image of what the universe was actually like, with the high-low quarks. And then the stagnation of being trapped, willfully trapped into something for just a little bit, and then having that drift away. So.
Good job, Miss Burnell. Good job. Well done. So, what advice would you give to someone just starting out in writing poetry?
Read the poets. Read older poets, read newer poets, read the poets. Read things that have nothing to do with poetry. Read books on philosophy, read books on beauty, read books on, historical events and science. Read, because you need to make sure you have a gorgeous well in which to plunder the words that you want. And only through kind of experiencing tons of different poetry can you start looking at what you want to do and where you want to go with certain things. It reminds me a little bit of, I saw Dune 2 last night with
Wow.
my spouse and my brother and his friend. And, you get to that point in the Siege, where you get to that beautiful
Sand dune.
lake. Yeah, the dunes in Dune, but that beautiful underground lake of the water that all the Fremen have been collecting from their deceased. It's a little morbid when you look at it that way, but they live in a desert society where water is precious, and there's this incredible lake of water underneath the sand, and one of the main characters goes, not even if we were dying of thirst would we touch this, because this is the memory of all of us. This is the promise that one day we will bring water back to Arrakis. And for me, reading poetry is a little like creating that lake. Everything you read, whether it's philosophy, whether it's the structure of poems, whether it's old myths, whether it's, the way that Paul Dini created the character of Harley Quinn, for Batman the Animated Series, whatever it is, you have to be a voracious reader. You have to be, and if you're somebody who are like, well, I want to get into poetry, but I've had this actually happen. There's a very good friend of mine who was wanting to write poetry, but happens to be incredibly dyslexic. And they were like, well, it's so tough to read. Oh, well, what about audiobooks? What about listening to the texture of the sound? What about that? Oh, is that so? That's fine. I was like, absolutely. If for some, accessibility reason, reading is a little bit more difficult, absolutely go for the audiobooks. Absolutely go for a format that works for you, but experience of as much of culture as you can, and as much of varied cultures. Don't just stay in, the cultures that you sort of live in and breathe around. One of my favorite things to do is look at translations of literature from other places. And, I speak a few languages, although English is the one that I predominantly work in now. And I have, it's like, when's the last time you had a conversation in en français? But,
Forget.
give me a couple weeks
Yes.
and I'm back to
Yes.
fluency. But I love looking at works from different languages and different experiences, because if you're not reading, well, what does a French poet think of this kind of thing? What does a Thai poet make of the story of, Andaman and the Dragons? Like, what can you make of all these things? Well, if you are not reading the literature with translations that are quite, authentic to the original language, sometimes you got to be kind of careful there when you're looking at some translations, because you're like, oh, when was this translation made? In the 1800s? Okay, I'm going to skip that and go to something else. But read, absorb things that are not just poetry. Because I think, too, poetry being so experimental and being so itself, it can kind of get a little echo chambery if that's all you're reading, so branch out. I have written more poems after reading books on physics than I have after reading, say, a book on the essentials of poetry, like what's right here. Mary Oliver's A Poetry Handbook. Now, Mary Oliver's A Poetry Handbook is a really good primer for kind of the pieces of poetry, how to understand it, how to break it down, how to write it. So when you want to know more about how to write poetry, I would go with the A Poetry Handbook. Not necessarily in a biblical fashion, as in this is your Bible, you must use it, but it is one resource that's really quite good.
Yes, well said, Miss Burnell. And read, people. And that will give you vital information in your writing, whatever genre you are
Mm-hmm.
wanting to write. So, Miss Burnell, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Everybody, I would adore it if you went out and found Usurper Kings and purchased it, or any of my books like Char and Dash, Son of Abel, Neon Lieben, or Macabre and Monstrous. I really do, as an author and as a Canadian author, it is tough out there. It is tough, and we do what we need to do to make it through. And I would love to be able to create more stories for you. You can get more information on my books by going to my website, www.saphaburnell.com. That is SAPHABURNELL.com. And there are links to all of the different places that have my books right there on the homepage. You can click them and start going if anything fits your fancy. You can also follow me on social media. I'm on X, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Twitch. You can find me at Usurper Kings. That is at Usurper Kings. If you see at Usurper Kings on social media, that's most likely me. And you can also find me on the podcast We Aren't Dead Yet, which is a podcast on TTRPGs, nerd fiction, and culture that comes out every Thursday, everywhere podcasts are. And that is something that I do with my two friends, Emily and Daz. And Daz has 30 years of experience as a game master for things like D&D, and is a woman who was in the American military back in the 90s. So, she's got an incredible point of view. And then Emily Armstrong is an award-winning producer who has worked with incredible people in sound and in both music and in audiobook and audio drama, and is also a internationally awarded world builder. So we have a lot of fun.
Yes.
Hope you catch it.
Yes,
and
people.
Hope you listen to all of our Book 101 interviews. You can find them everywhere you find podcasts, and they're amazing.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Sapha Burnell and Book 101 Review, because we empowering writers all over the world. So, Miss Burnell, catch you next week. Let's continue reading a poem.
I'll be ready for you.
We are ready, people. So catch you tune in next week. I don't know what happened to our live on LinkedIn. It doesn't happen, but I will check it out, people, because how many times I'll do the event, but every time the live session is not coming out. So, Miss Burnell, thank you for your time.
And thank you very much, and have a fantastic week.
More to come, people. See you soon.
Bye.